Marcus Blake was humiliated in a restaurant because of his skin color, but a week later, he came back to fire the waiter, this time as the new owner of the establishment. What happened next would shock even those who thought they'd seen it all. But let's start from the very beginning. Marcus Blake stepped out of his office, where the echoes of a recent victory in a difficult case still resounded. Breathing in the cool evening air, he felt serene. Today was his day. A day of well-deserved triumph, where everything seemed possible. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit, chosen with the same attention to detail he used when preparing his cases. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, tapped softly against the pavement, and his gold cufflinks reflected the glow of the streetlights. Confidence and dignity radiated from him like warmth from a fireplace. Marcus approached the doors of Elegance, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. Here, haute cuisine was served, and people with names and status gathered. The soft glow of golden lamps behind the glass doors beckoned with coziness and refinement. He slowed his pace, allowing himself to savor the moment. Tonight, he wanted to celebrate his victory, even if it was alone. He pushed open the heavy door, and a world of refined luxury opened before him. Snow-white tablecloths, crystal glasses, flickering candles, and the quiet clinking of dishes coming from the depths of the room. Inside, there was a subdued murmur of conversation, the aroma of fresh herbs and delicate spices mingling with the expensive perfumes of the guests. Marcus took a few steps forward, his gaze sweeping the hall where couples and groups sat at perfectly set tables. Faces were calm, manners impeccable. He approached the reception stand, where a young waiter with perfectly styled blonde hair greeted him. Marcus smiled politely, expecting the standard question about his reservation. "A table for one, please," he said with dignity and warmth in his voice. The waiter glanced at Marcus, a brief look, but filled with something cold and sharp, like a shard of ice. His eyes scanned Marcus's expensive suit, but didn't see someone worthy of this place. The waiter's lips curled into a condescending smirk, as if he had heard a ridiculous joke. "We're fully booked," he said, lazily glancing at the reservation list, not bothering to open it. His voice carried a false politeness, laced with hostility. "Try something simpler for you. Maybe the diner on the corner?" The words struck Marcus like a knife. His smile froze. The hum of conversation at the table suddenly quieted. The air in the restaurant grew heavy. He felt the eyes of the other diners on him, some curious, some filled with hidden ridicule, and others showing pity, which he hated most of all. Marcus looked around the hall. Several tables were empty. The white tablecloths were perfectly smoothed. The glasses awaited wine, and the chairs invited guests to sit. But for him, there were no seats. These tables were for anyone but him. "Excuse me, but I see empty tables." His voice was restrained, but steel rang in it. He wasn't used to refusals, especially ones so blatantly humiliating. The waiter raised an eyebrow, looking at him with barely concealed contempt. "Those tables are reserved, sir." The last word spat out like an insult. His cold gaze said, "You don't belong here." Pain flared in Marcus's chest, mixed with anger and hurt. This scene wasn't new to him. He had seen it hundreds of times in different forms. But each time, it pierced him, as if it were the first. He remembered his grandfather's stories of being turned away from restaurants, of whites-only signs, of looks that cut deeper than any knife. Marcus had spent his life striving to be better, to be successful, to prove he was worthy. But now, all of that crumbled before the indifferent face of the waiter. Marcus clenched his jaw, his fingers trembled. He could have said something sharp, demanded the manager, made a scene. But he knew any display of emotion would be used against him. Another story of the angry black man who didn't know his place. Slowly, with dignity, he turned and walked toward the exit. Each step echoed in his ears like the drumbeat of humiliation. He felt the eyes burning into his back, judgment filling the room. In his eyes, a fire burned. Not of shame, but of resolve. Outside, the evening air was cold and sharp. The streetlights glowed dimly, as if even they had turned away from him. But inside Marcus, something burned much brighter. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. "This won't stand," he whispered, looking at the city lights. Marcus Blake walked along the sidewalk, each step thudding in his ears, like a nail being driven into his consciousness. The night air chilled his face, but he didn't feel it. The city, usually lively and welcoming, seemed alien and empty tonight. Streetlights flickered with a cold light. Neon signs blinked dimly, as if they too had lost faith in humanity. Each step reminded him of the scene at Elegance that had unfolded just minutes ago, yet had already left a deep scar on his soul. He walked aimlessly, just to keep moving. Something inside his chest tightened like a spring, ready to uncoil and release all the pain, all the anger accumulated over the years. He felt like that little boy again, left standing outside an amusement park because a sign on the gate clearly read, "Whites only." No matter how much he studied, worked, or succeeded, moments like today ruthlessly reminded him that, in the eyes of some, he would always be the other, an outsider. Marcus stopped in front of the window of a closed cafe and stared at his reflection. The man in the expensive suit, with neatly styled hair and a tense line to his mouth, stared back. On the outside, he was confident, calm, successful. But behind that mask, emotions seethed: rage, hurt, disappointment, and, worst of all, a feeling of helplessness. He closed his eyes. Faces appeared before him. The faces of those who had fought before him. His grandfather, a strong, wrinkled man who lived through a time when even a drinking fountain was off limits to him. His grandfather, who went to work every day in humiliating conditions so his children could learn and dream. His grandfather, who told him stories of sit-in protests at diners where they were refused service, of marches for equal rights, of every step toward freedom met with spit and fists. "You will never be alone, Marcus," his grandfather had said. "Every time you fight for yourself, you fight for all of us." Those words rang in his mind like a bell. He thought of his mother, a strong woman who worked 3 jobs to give him the best education. How she stood next to him at a school conference when a teacher sneered, "Your son is too ambitious for a boy of his background." Her eyes had shone with steel as she firmly said, "My son will achieve whatever he wants, and neither you nor anyone else will decide what he can be." Now that same steel had to be in his eyes. "Why does this still happen in the 21st century?" Marcus whispered, clenching his fists so hard that his nails dug into his palms. Thousands of scenarios flashed through his mind. Scenes where he returned to the restaurant and demanded respect, where he publicly exposed the waiter, where he sued the establishment for discrimination. But each of these options felt insufficient. Marcus knew the problem ran deeper. It was in the system, in traditions, in generations of unheard voices. Suddenly, a new resolve ignited within him. This wasn't just a personal insult. This was a moment where he could do more than just defend his honor. This was a chance to change the rules, to show that respect couldn't be taken away with a glance or a word. He turned sharply and walked home quickly. Every step was filled with purpose, as if invisible strings no longer held him back. The door to his home shut behind him with a heavy thud. The living room was wrapped in silence. He sank into a chair, ran his hands over his face as if to erase the fatigue and hurt. But instead, he felt a wave of clarity and calm fury rising within him. His mother always said, "Use your resources to change the world." And now he knew what to do. His resources, knowledge, and success, all of it was a weapon in the fight for justice. He couldn't just forget what had happened. He couldn't let anyone else leave that restaurant with the same feeling of humiliation. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number of his old friend Mike, an experienced real estate agent. The line crackled. Then Mike's sleepy voice came through. "Marcus, everything okay?" "Mike." Marcus's voice was firm and decisive. "Remember the restaurant Elegance?" "Yeah, why?" Mike clearly didn't understand where this was going. "Find out who owns it. I want to buy it." There was silence on the other end. "Are you sure? That's an expensive place?" "I've never been more sure," Marcus said, his gaze sharp as a blade. "I don't just want to buy it, I want to show them their time is up. I'll handle it, Mike replied, understanding in his voice. Marcus hung up and leaned back in his chair. For the first time that day, he felt peace. The chaos in his mind was gone, replaced by a clear goal and a plan. He was ready to show the world that dignity didn't depend on skin color, ready to remind everyone that respect isn't a gift, it's earned. At dawn, the city was shaking off its slumber, but Marcus Blake was already sitting in his office, carefully reviewing documents. The sheets of paper smelled of fresh printer ink, and the letters on them felt like nails being driven into the coffin of old injustices. In his hands was the power to not just make a purchase, but to change the rules of the game. His heart beat steadily and confidently. This deal wasn't just business. It was vengeance. It was justice. It was a new chapter. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Standing in the doorway was Mike, the real estate agent, holding a stack of documents and a slightly crumpled envelope from his long night of work. "Everything's ready, Marcus," Mike said, handing over the papers, his gaze serious. "The restaurant's owner is desperate for money. Debts are strangling him, and the business is on the brink of collapse. He's willing to sell for a price that, for you, is manageable." Marcus took the papers, his fingers gripping them firmly. Determination boiled inside him. For so long, elegance had seemed like an impenetrable fortress, a symbol of inaccessible superiority. But now, that fortress was crumbling. Marcus was ready to become the architect of its rebirth. "When's the meeting?" he asked, his voice hard as steel. "In an hour," Mike replied. "We'll meet right at the restaurant." Marcus nodded and stood up from his chair. He glanced at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him was more than a successful attorney. He was a warrior, ready to reclaim his dignity and break down the walls of prejudice. The owner of the restaurant, Mr. Langley, was a man in his 50s with a weary face and eyes full of worry. His expensive suit hung on his shoulders like an old cloak, and his temples were streaked with gray. His eyes betrayed a struggle for survival, a struggle he seemed to have already lost. "Mr. Blake," Langley said, trying to smile, but his lips trembled with tension. "I'm glad you're interested in the purchase. I hope you can restore elegance to its former glory." Marcus nodded silently, his eyes scanning the numbers that reflected the restaurant's dire financial state. Debts, overdue payments, dwindling customer flow, all consequences of poor management and arrogance. Marcus signed the papers with a firm hand, as if sealing not only the deal, but also his right to respect. "The deal is complete," the notary announced, his voice sounding like a stamp on history. "Elegance now belongs to you." Marcus stood and extended his hand to Langley. Their handshake was brief, but full of understanding. One man losing control, the other gaining power. 1 week later. Marcus stood before the glass doors of elegance, which now reflected not only his strength, but also a new era. Today, everything would change. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked inside. His steps were confident, his gaze cold and resolute. Beside him walked the new manager, Jonathan Lawrence, a man with experience in the restaurant business and a reputation for fairness. Marcus knew that with Jonathan in charge, elegance would become a place where every customer felt welcome, regardless of skin color or social status. The restaurant looked exactly as Marcus had seen it that fateful night. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, soft lighting. But today, everything felt different. The air was charged with the anticipation of change. At the reception stand stood the same waiter, the young man with the cold gaze and smug smirk, now wiped away by the sight of Marcus. His face went pale, his eyes widened in shock and fear. He couldn't believe that the man he had humiliated just a week ago now stood before him as the owner. "Welcome," the waiter mumbled, his voice trembling, his attempt at politeness pathetic. Marcus smiled, a smile filled with strength rather than kindness. "You know," he said calmly, looking the waiter straight in the eyes, "last week you told me to look for a simpler place, but now I'm looking for new employees." The waiter's mouth opened as he tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. His face flushed, his eyes darted around, looking for support, but there was none. In that moment, he realized that his arrogance had cost him everything. Marcus paused, letting his words hang in the air. "You're fired," he stated firmly. It was like a lightning bolt striking the room. The waiter staggered back, as if physically struck. He lowered his eyes, his hands shaking, his face twisted with the realization of his downfall. Marcus turned to Jonathan and nodded. "Let's start over," he said, his voice carrying not just determination, but liberation. Today, he hadn't just bought a restaurant. He had reclaimed his dignity, his respect, and proved that true strength lies in the ability to make the world better. The next day, the bright sun bathed the city streets in golden light. It seemed as if nature itself was celebrating a new dawn, a new chapter about to begin. On the facade of the former elegance now gleamed a new sign with a proud name: Legacy. The elegant letters were crafted with refined simplicity, but each curve spoke of deep history, memory, and respect. This restaurant was no longer a symbol of exclusivity. Now it was a symbol of change. Marcus stood on the steps at the entrance, upright like a soldier before battle. The morning reflected in his eyes, but inside, something even brighter shone. The satisfaction of knowing his family's long struggle had led to this moment of victory. He adjusted the cuffs of his perfectly tailored suit and took a deep breath. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread, coffee, and new hope. Behind him, the door swung open and the first visitors entered the restaurant. Among them were people of all ages and colors: young couples, families with children, elderly people who had supported his fight since the days of civil rights marches. Their faces glowed with smiles, their eyes sparkled with joy and pride. They were here not just for the food. They were here to support an idea, a change, a new reality that Marcus had helped create. Inside Legacy, everything was renewed. The bright walls displayed photographs of key moments in the struggle for equality: marches in the streets, scenes of peaceful protest, portraits of movement leaders. Every detail of the interior conveyed that this place was not just a restaurant. It was a tribute to those who gave everything for the future. Marcus had carefully chosen the new staff, focusing on professionalism and human dignity. Among the waiters was Melissa, a young woman who dreamed of becoming a restaurateur, and Jerome, a former veteran who had found a second chance here. In the kitchen, chefs from different cultures and backgrounds worked side by side: African Americans, Latinos, Asians. Their diversity reflected the city as it truly was. A framed policy of zero tolerance for discrimination hung by the entrance like a manifesto of a new era. Every guest deserves respect. Every employee has equal opportunities. There is no place for hatred or prejudice here. News that a prominent black attorney had bought the restaurant and transformed its core spread through the city like wildfire. Headlines in local papers blared with support. Legacy of justice. How Marcus Blake changed the rules. A restaurant where everyone is welcome. Social media buzzed with praise. People shared the story, noting that small victories lead to big changes. Under one post, someone wrote, "Thank you, Marcus, for showing us that the past doesn't define our future. This place now belongs to all of us." Those words touched Marcus deeply. He knew this was more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of the fight, the memory, and the change. A place where everyone could feel equal, regardless of skin color or origin. In the evening, as the sun set, casting golden pink hues over the city, Marcus stood at the entrance of Legacy. He watched happy customers leaving the restaurant, laughing and thanking the staff. Parents held their children's hands, and Marcus knew that for them, this place would be a memory filled with warmth and justice. An elderly woman with silver hair and deep wrinkles approached him. Her eyes glowed with tenderness and respect. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. "You did what my husband always dreamed of seeing." Marcus nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "This is just the beginning," he replied with a smile. "We're never going back." He felt peace and pride filling him to the brim. Today, he hadn't just won a personal battle. He had taken a step toward changing society. A step that had once been impossible for his ancestors, but was now a reality thanks to their sacrifices. Marcus looked at the legacy sign, illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights, and knew this victory belonged to everyone.